In this video, we'll look at every person executed in the United States in 2023. Together, they spent over 540 years on death row, waiting to be executed. We'll walk through the crimes that put them on death row, the final words they spoke, and the last meals they requested before facing execution. But before we start, let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. On January 3, 2023, Amber McLaughlin was executed by lethal injection. But the story behind that sentence began more than 20 years earlier in St. Louis, Missouri. On November 20, 2003, Amber McLaughlin, then known as Scott McLaughlin, waited outside Beverly Guenther's workplace. Their relationship had been rocky for a long time, full of breakups, restraining orders, and angry visits. And even after they broke up, Scott kept showing up, uninvited. Just 2 days earlier, Beverly had gotten another protective order to try and keep Scott away after he broke into her house. But unfortunately, this didn't stop him. That night, Scott waited in the dark until Beverly left work. As she walked toward her truck, he struck, knocking her to the ground and keeping her right there in the parking lot. Then came the knife. Again and again, he stabbed her, blood splattering across the pavement in a violent blur of rage. When it was over, he dragged Beverly's body into her car and drove off. His plan was to dump her into the river, but the thick brush along the bank made it impossible. So he left her there in the weeds, barely hidden, and climbed back into the car. But one of the tires had gone flat, so he didn't get far. Instead, he laid down and slept inside the vehicle just feet from the riverbank and from Beverly's lifeless body. The next day, Scott scrubbed the car's interior with bleach, trying to erase what had happened. But bleach couldn't fix guilt, and by that afternoon, it was eating him alive. He started to spiral, panicking more by the hour. Eventually, he asked someone to drive him to a hospital in St. Charles, saying he needed medication. But it was too late. The police were already waiting. As soon as Scott stepped through the hospital doors, they moved in and took him into custody. Charged with first-degree murder, forcible rape, and armed criminal action, Scott's trial unfolded in 2006. The jury found him guilty. But when it came time to decide death or life, they couldn't agree on the punishment. In Missouri, the judge can step in if the jury deadlocks, and that's exactly what happened. The judge sentenced Scott to death. While on death row, Scott transitioned from male to female and started to use the name Amber. Years later, she became the first openly transgender person to be executed in the U.S. She spent 16 years on death row. For her last meal, Amber asked for a cheeseburger, French fries, a strawberry milkshake, and peanut M&Ms. Her final statement was simple: "I am sorry for what I did. I am a loving and caring person." On January 3, 2023, the state carried out her execution by lethal injection in Missouri. She was pronounced dead at 6:51 p.m. Amber McLaughlin was 49 years old. Oof, that crime was just cruel, and that was only the beginning. Let's continue with the next execution scheduled just a week later. What did he do? On the evening of November 9, 1994, in Atascocita, Texas, Fratta had dinner with her estranged husband and ex-cop, Robert, and their children. On the surface, it looked like a normal night. Just two separated parents going through the motions for their kids. After they ate, Robert dropped the younger two off at the church nursery and took the oldest to catechism class. Meanwhile, Farrah had a haircut scheduled. She came home afterward, pulling into her garage as darkness settled over the neighborhood. But she never made it inside. Just as she stepped out of her car, a man stepped out of the shadows and fired twice. The shots hit her in the head. Farrah collapsed next to her car and died there without ever seeing who pulled the trigger. The shooter was 18-year-old Howard Guidry, a hired gunman. He jumped into a waiting getaway car driven by Joseph Pristash. But the one who set everything in motion, the man behind the plan, was Robert Fratta, a former public safety officer. Robert had spent months ranting to anyone who'd listen, friends, gym buddies, co-workers, saying he wanted his wife gone. He couldn't stand the divorce, hated losing custody of his 3 kids, and eventually he didn't just talk about it, he made it happen and paid for it. At first, the police didn't have much, no solid evidence. Robert came off cold after Farah's murder, but that wasn't enough to arrest him. The case stalled until months later when Howard was caught during a bank robbery and found with a gun that matched the murder weapon used on Farah. That changed everything. Later, the girlfriend of the getaway driver came forward, and the truth unraveled fast. Both Joseph and Howard confessed. But they didn't say it was random. Their stories pointed to the one person who'd set it all in motion, Robert. He promised Howard $1,000 to carry it out, and Joseph was offered even more, $2,000 and a Jeep, just to help set the plan in motion. Robert was arrested in early 1995 and charged with capital murder. At trial in 1996, the jury didn't need long to decide. He was guilty, and they sentenced him to death. Howard Guidry and Joseph Pristash were also sentenced to death, but no execution date has been scheduled as of right now, and they remain on death row. On January 10, 2023, after 14 years on death row, Robert was led into the death chamber at the Huntsville unit. He declined to make a final statement and wasn't allowed to choose a special final meal. He had what the other prisoners had that day. After the drugs started to flow, he was pronounced dead at 7:49 p.m. Robert Fratta was 65 years old. And just 2 days later, another inmate faced the same fate. But what did he do? Let's take a look. On October 18, 2003, in Depew, Oklahoma, Scott Eizember broke into the house across from his ex-girlfriend's, planning to wait until she came home. He was furious at Kathy Biggs for tipping off the police about a protective order violation, and he wanted revenge. But the house he chose didn't stay empty for long. AJ and Patsy Cantrell, the elderly couple who lived there, returned home and walked straight into a nightmare. Inside, Scott was waiting with their own shotgun aimed at them. There was a tense exchange, no chaos at first. Somehow, things calmed enough that Scott lowered the gun. That's when AJ saw his chance. He lunged for the shotgun, fired it, and hit Scott in the hand. But in the chaos, the blast also struck Patsy, killing her instantly. That was the moment everything spiraled. Enraged and bleeding, Scott wrestled the shotgun back and beat AJ until he collapsed. Then he dragged both of them into the bathroom, leaving AJ barely breathing beside his wife's lifeless body. But Scott wasn't done just yet. He came with a plan and wanted to execute it. He crossed the street with the shotgun still in his hand and barged into Kathy's house. Her son, Tyler Montgomery, spotted him and tried to flee, but Scott shot him in the back. He then beat Kathy's mother, Carla Wright, with the gun. Even though he was wounded, Tyler managed to stumble outside, climb into his truck, and drive off in a desperate attempt to escape. But Scott wasn't letting go. He jumped into the bed of the truck, hanging on, as Tyler swerved wildly, trying to shake him off. Scott shot him again before Tyler crashed into a pole and fled on foot, bleeding and terrified, searching for help. Scott ran in the other direction, eventually hitching a ride, but when the driver got suspicious, Scott fired a shot at him too before bailing out and disappearing once more. For 11 days, Scott vanished into the woods, staying just out of reach. He stole clothes, grabbed a pistol, and took whatever supplies he could from nearby homes, slipping past the police again and again. He found a car outside a church and took it, but ran out of gas soon after. He ditched it and stuck out his thumb, hoping a stranger would get him one step farther from justice. That's when Dr. Sam Peebles and his wife Suzanne spotted him on the side of the road and offered him a ride. But once he got inside the car, Scott pulled a pistol on them and forced them to drive toward Texas. For hours, he threatened to kill them if they resisted. But during a stop in Texas, Sam fought back and managed to shoot Scott with his own revolver. Scott wrestled the gun away and beat Sam, then tried to shoot Suzanne, but the gun jammed, so he hit her instead and fled into the night. Wounded and desperate, Scott stumbled into a convenience store where someone noticed his injuries and called the police. There was nowhere left to go. When officers arrived, they took him into custody and rushed him to the hospital. After he recovered, he was shackled, placed under guard, and sent straight back to Oklahoma to face the justice waiting for him. At trial in 2005, Scott was convicted of first-degree murder for killing A.J., second-degree felony murder for Patsy's death, and multiple assault charges for his attacks on Tyler and Carla, and ruled the murder was especially heinous. Therefore, they sentenced him to death. After spending 18 years on death row, he requested a medium-rare ribeye steak with 2 sides of fries as his final meal. While strapped to the gurney at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary on January 12, 2023, Scott gave his final words. "I'm at peace. My conscience is clear, completely. I love my children." As the drugs began to flow, he mouthed, "I love you," to his daughter sitting in the witness room. He was pronounced dead at 10:15 a.m. Scott Eizember was 62 years old. Now let's fast forward to February 2023, when Wesley Ruiz was scheduled to be executed. What did he do to deserve the death penalty? On March 23, 2007, in Dallas, Texas, the sun was starting to set when 2 plainclothes officers spotted a red and gray Chevy Caprice slipping through traffic. The car had chrome wheels and dark-tinted windows, just like the vehicle described in a recent homicide bulletin. That's when their instincts kicked in. But they didn't light it up, not yet. They called for backup and shadowed the car as it slipped off the freeway into West Dallas. Mark Nix was one of the officers who answered that call. He rolled in behind the Caprice with his lights flashing and dash camera rolling. For a second, it looked like the driver was going to stop. But then, without warning, the tires screamed and the car tore off into the night. What started as a routine stop had turned into a high-speed pursuit, and Mark wasn't backing off. Then the driver of the Chevy lost control. The car hit a curb hard and spun out, sliding backward down a shallow slope before coming to rest just feet from a chain-link fence. Mark didn't hesitate. He pulled up fast, bumper to bumper, and jumped out. His pistol was in one hand, his baton in the other. But when he reached the passenger side, he dropped the gun to the pavement, freeing both hands to swing. He raised the baton and brought it down, again and again, hammering the dark-tinted window until a small hole cracked through the glass. And that's when the shot came. It tore through the rear window and the bullet hit Mark's badge. The metal shattered and a razor-edged fragment punched through his chest, cutting through his carotid artery. He collapsed before he could even make a sound. Behind him, officers shouted and returned fire as Mark hit the ground. They pulled him back to safety, calling out for SWAT, but it was already too late. When it was over and the gunfire stopped, they approached the car. The man behind the wheel was Wesley Ruiz. He was unconscious, slumped over, bleeding. In his hand, still gripped tight, was the pistol that had taken Mark's life. There was no one else inside. Wesley was arrested on the spot and charged with capital murder. At his 2008 trial, the jury took less than an hour to decide, and he was sentenced to death. For the next 15 years, he sat on death row, appealing his case without success. Then came February 1st, 2023. At the Huntsville unit, Wesley was led into the execution chamber. He wasn't allowed a final meal request and ate whatever was served that day. As the IV lines were connected and the clock ticked down, he used his last words to look back. "I would like to apologize to Mark and the Nix family," he said. "I hope this brings you closure. To my kids, stand tall and continue to make me proud. Don't worry about me. I'm going to be okay." At 6:41 p.m., Wesley Ruiz was pronounced dead. He was 43 years old. And less than 1 week later, the next execution was scheduled. Let's find out what Leonard Taylor did and what his final moments were like. On December 3, 2004, police forced their way into a locked house in Jennings, Missouri, after neighbors grew worried about the silence and the pile of unopened mail on the porch. Inside, the television was still on, and the air conditioner had been set to an icy 50 degrees. And when they got to the back of the house, officers found the reason for the silence. Right there, they found 4 bodies: Angela Rowe and her 3 children, 10-year-old Alexis, 6-year-old Acrea, and little Tyrese, just 5 years old. Each had been shot in the head, and no one had survived. In fact, all bodies were already decomposing, and the smell made clear this hadn't just happened. The medical examiner later estimated they'd been dead for 2 to 3 weeks, and someone had tried to freeze the timeline, literally. But nothing could hide what had happened inside that house. At the time of the murders, Angela Rowe had been dating Leonard Taylor, who disappeared around the time Angela stopped showing up to work. Then, on November 23rd, he called his brother in a panic, asking him for money. And then came the confession. "I killed Angela. I didn't mean to kill her, but she came at me with a knife, and I couldn't get her off of me. I shot her 2 or 3 times." And then, like it was nothing, he added, "I killed the kids too." But it didn't stop there. Over the next 2 days, Leonard made a string of strange phone calls, some from Angela's landline, others from his own cell. His words were scattered, uneasy, and during one of those calls, he confessed again. He told his brother the house felt cold because he'd cranked up the air conditioning and shut off the heat. Then he vanished. On November 26th, Leonard slipped out of St. Louis under a fake name, Louis Bradley. He booked a flight to California and caught a ride to the airport after ditching a pistol into a sewer. On the way, he told his sister-in-law, "This will probably be the last time you see me alive." For a while, he stayed hidden. He was spotted in California with his wife, Debreen Williams, then later turned up in Georgia, and again in Kentucky. Every time the trail went cold, he surfaced somewhere new. But it didn't last. On December 9th, officers tracked him to a house in Kentucky, another girlfriend's place. They staked it out, watching and waiting. Eventually, Leonard tried to make a quiet escape. He slid into the passenger seat of a car and laid flat across the floorboards, hoping to disappear into the shadows once again. But it didn't work. When the car was stopped and the door yanked open, Leonard looked up and tried one more lie. He said his name was Jason Lovely. But the truth had already caught up to him. At trial, the case against him came together fast. There were phone calls made from the scene, confessions to his brother, and witnesses who described his strange behavior. And although some people claimed to have heard from Angela days after the murders, the phone records said otherwise. It took the jury just 4 hours before finding him guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder, and they didn't hesitate. They sentenced Leonard to die. On February 7, 2023, after spending 15 years on death row, Leonard requested a seafood platter, a cheeseburger, French fries, cheesecake, and vanilla ice cream. He declined to speak aloud but left a written statement quoting the Quran. If you want to read his full statement, pause right here. It ended with, "Death is not your enemy, it is your destiny. Look forward to meeting it. Peace." He was pronounced dead at 6:16 p.m. Leonard Taylor was 59 years old. The death chamber didn't stay quiet for long. Just 24 hours later, another execution was already underway. But who was next, and what had he done to end up here? On a quiet night in 1998, John Balentine walked back into a house he used to call home, an Amarillo address he once shared with his ex-girlfriend, Misty Kaler. He slipped inside while everyone was sleeping. Inside were 3 teenage boys, 2 of them he didn't even know. The third was Misty's younger brother, a boy who had made it very clear he didn't approve of John. He had even threatened John before, said he'd kill him for how he treated Misty. But it wasn't just about behavior, it was about race. John was black and Misty was white, and her brother didn't hide how he felt about that. John didn't come to talk. He brought a pistol, and while the boys lay asleep, unaware of what was coming, he raised the gun and pulled the trigger. One after another, 17-year-old Edward Kaler and 15-year-olds Kai Brooke Geyer and Stephen Watson were shot in the head before they even had a chance to wake up. And by sunrise, 3 teenagers were dead. John was 30 at the time, and he didn't deny what he'd done. He confessed. In April 1999, a jury found him guilty of capital murder and sentenced him to death. Over the next 24 years, his defense team argued that the trial had been soaked in racial bias, from the jury selection to the closing arguments. They claimed that John's life might have been spared if the process had been fair, but the courts never agreed. On February 8, 2023, John was strapped to the gurney inside the Huntsville unit in Texas. He wasn't allowed to choose a special final meal and ate what the other inmates got. When asked if he had any final words, he said, "Yes, ma'am, I want to thank y'all. I love y'all for supporting me. I want to apologize for the wrong I did to y'all. Forgive me. I'm ready, ma'am." He was pronounced dead at 6:36 p.m. John Balentine was 54 years old. Well, that was something. Now let's continue with the next execution. On June 24, 1990, Donald Dillbeck walked out of a prison work-release catering job in Gadsden County and vanished into the woods. He was supposed to be serving a life sentence. But that day, he disappeared, walking down Highway 90 toward Tallahassee with a knife and a plan that he hadn't fully thought through. 2 days later, he spotted a woman sitting alone in a car outside the Tallahassee Mall. Her name was Faye Lam Van. She was waiting for her sons and grandchild, who had gone inside to return some clothes. Donald tried to carjack her, but she fought back. So he stabbed her again and again, slashing her throat with a paring knife and leaving her to die in the driver's seat. The car crashed into another parked car as she tried to escape, drawing the attention of bystanders and mall security. That's when Donald tried to escape on foot, but he didn't get far. The security guard was right behind him, and minutes later, police found him hiding in a nearby backyard with the knife still in his hand. And Faye wasn't the first life he'd taken. Back in 1979, Donald was just 15 when he was caught sleeping inside a stolen car at a beach park in Fort Myers. A sheriff's deputy, Dwight Lynn Hall, responded to the call. It should have been routine. But when he tried to make the arrest, Donald bolted. The deputy chased him down and tackled him, but during the scuffle, his gun slipped from its holster. Donald got to it first and shot him dead. That should have been the end of it, and he was sentenced to life. But in 1990, through a series of low-security placements, he got out again and killed again. In March 1991, he was sentenced to death. On the morning of February 23, 2023, after spending 32 years on death row, Donald followed his usual routine, spoke with his spiritual advisor, and waited. For his last meal, he requested fried shrimp, mushrooms, onion rings, butter pecan ice cream, pecan pie, and a chocolate bar. When the curtain opened at Florida State Prison, Donald looked calm. His final words were a mix of reflection and rage. "I know I hurt people when I was young. I really messed up. But I know Ron DeSantis has done a lot worse. He's taken a lot from a lot of people. Ron DeSantis and other people like him can suck our dicks." At 6:02 p.m., the execution began, and 11 minutes later, at 6:13, Donald Dillbeck was pronounced dead. He was 59 years old. As one case ended, another one was already moving toward the same outcome just 2 weeks later. But what happened? On September 21, 2009, Gary Green sat alone in his Texas apartment, staring at 2 handwritten letters. They were from his wife, Lavetta Armstead. The words were calm but firm. She told him it was over and that he needed to move out. That she loved him, but it was time to do what was best for her and her children. But Gary didn't walk away. He picked up a pen and wrote a response of his own, only his letter wasn't filled with heartbreak. It was soaked in rage. In it, he warned that 5 people would die that night: Lavetta, her 3 children, and himself. Then he grabbed the knives. He started with 10-year-old Jasmine. She was in her bedroom when he tied her up and taped her mouth shut. Then he led her down the hall into the master bedroom, where Lavetta was reading the very letter he had just written. That's when it all unraveled. What happened next stretched out for more than an hour. He stabbed Lavetta over and over more than 25 times until the fight left her body. Then he turned back to Jasmine. He dragged her into the bathroom, filled the tub, and held her under the water. She fought, she kicked, but eventually she stopped. Later, Gary told investigators that he couldn't bear to watch her, so he turned his head away. Then he cleaned himself up, put on a fresh set of dress clothes, and drove off to pick up Lovetta's two sons, 12-year-old JT and 10-year-old Jarrett, from a youth event at church. The boys were confused. Their mom usually picked them up, but Gary smiled, said nothing, and brought them home. Back at the house, he gave JT and Jarrett simple instructions. Gary told JT to go take a shower and Jarrett to change into his pajamas. Nothing seemed out of place until Gary called Jarrett into the kitchen to talk about school. That's when he pulled out the knife. From the bathroom, JT heard screaming. He opened the door and saw his stepfather forcing Jarrett inside, a knife pressed against his throat. Gary slammed the door shut and locked it behind them. Then he sat on the bathroom counter, laid 3 knives out beside him, and looked at the boys. Calmly, he asked why he shouldn't kill them too. Jarrett begged for their lives. He said they were too young. He promised to stay quiet and promised not to tell. But Gary didn't listen. He drove the knife into Jarrett's stomach. JT tried to stop him but missed. Gary paused for a moment, then calmly told them he'd changed his mind. He said he wouldn't kill them. Instead, he led them down the hall into the master bedroom. There, he showed them their mother's body. He told them it had to be done, that she was going to leave him, and he loved her to death. Before leaving, Gary went to the dresser and changed into clean clothes again. He handed JT a few pills and told him to call 911 after he was gone. He said he planned to take his own life. Then, like it was just another goodbye, he made both boys hug him one by one before walking out the door. The boys did exactly what he told them. They called 911, then ran from the house, pounding on a neighbor's door, screaming that their mom and sister had been murdered. Police arrived within minutes. In the bedroom, 2 letters sat side by side on the bed. One was from Lovetta, the goodbye note to Gary. The other was his response that laid out his plan. "You asked to see the monster, so here he is," it read. "There will be 5 lives taken today, me being the 5th. But Gary didn't go through with that last part. At 2:15 a.m., just hours after the murders, he walked into a nearby police substation with his mother and brother by his side. He told officers everything, how he heard voices, how he believed his wife and her children were plotting against him. He thought that if he killed them all, they'd be reunited in heaven. At trial, there was no room for doubt. Jurors saw the taped confession. They read the letters. They listened to the testimony from the surviving boys. And in November 2010, Gary Green was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. He spent the next 13 years on death row. On March 7, 2023, at the Huntsville unit, Gary Green was served his last meal and led to the execution chamber. Strapped to the gurney, he gave his final words. "I took not one, but 2 people that we all loved, and I had to live with that while I was here. I ask that you forgive me, not for me, but for y'all. You have to forgive me to heal and move on." He was pronounced dead at 7:07 p.m. Gary Green was 52 years old. The guards didn't have much time to rest, as the next inmate was already waiting for his turn just 2 days later. But what did he do? On June 20th, 1992, inside a small brick house on Brownstone Lane, 6 people waited. The plan was supposed to be simple. Trade a few kilos of cocaine for quick cash, then everyone walks away. But the 3 men who walked through the door had no intention of paying. Arthur Brown Jr. walked in first. Marion Dudley and Tony Dunson followed close behind. They didn't knock. They didn't ask. They came armed, ready, and without mercy. As soon as they were inside, the guns came out. They tied everyone up, face down on the floor. No one knew yet just how far this was going to go, but the men who stormed that house didn't come to leave witnesses. Then the gunfire started, quick, cold, execution style. One after another, they were shot in the head. When the shooting stopped, 4 people were dead. Jose Tover, Frank Farias, Audrey Brown, and Jessica Quinones, just 19 years old and 7 months pregnant. 2 others lay wounded but alive. and when they found the strength to speak, they named the men who had done it. By the time police got there, the house was soaked in blood, and Arthur was already gone. While families grieved and detectives chased leads, he disappeared, drifting from state to state under fake names, always just out of reach. But he couldn't hide forever. On October 23, 1992, officers tracked him to an apartment in Alabama. His luck had run out. He stood trial in 1993, and the jury didn't waste any time. Arthur and Marion were found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death, while Tony got life. Marion Dudley was executed in 2006, and Tony will be eligible for parole in 2027. On March 9, 2023, the Supreme Court denied Arthur's final request, and hours later, he was strapped to the gurney in Huntsville. He wasn't allowed to choose a special final meal, but he did give a last statement. "What is occurring here tonight is not justice," he said. "It's murder of an innocent man. I have no further words." At 6:37 p.m., the drugs began to flow. Arthur Brown Jr. was pronounced dead minutes later. He was 52 years old and had spent 30 years on death row. Now let's fast forward to April 2023, when the next inmate was scheduled to be executed. On the night of December 20th, 1989, Louis Gaskin moved through the quiet streets of Palm Coast, Florida, cloaked in black from head to toe. He moved with cold purpose, rifle in hand. Locals would later call him the Ninja Killer. But it wasn't his stealth that made the name stick. It was the way he hunted, silent and brutal. At the edge of town, Robert and Georgette Sturmfels were winding down for the evening. Robert sat back in his recliner, unaware that death was watching from the shadows. Georgette was nearby, resting on the couch. Through a back window, Louis raised his .22 caliber rifle and pulled the trigger 5 times. Robert never had a chance. He slumped in his chair as Georgette screamed and scrambled. She was hit too, but still breathing. Louis reloaded, walked to the house, stepped closer, and ended it with a final shot to her head. But he wasn't finished. A few hours later, he targeted another home, Joseph and Noreen Rector's. They were watching TV when bullets tore through the walls. Joseph took a round in the hip, and chaos erupted. The couple fled into a closet, holding their breath as Louis broke in through a back window. When he couldn't find them, he tore the place apart. But just as he circled back around, Joseph and Noreen made a break for their car. Louis opened fire again as they sped off, but missed. When the police arrived, they found the house ransacked, drawers pulled out, belongings scattered. He hadn't just come to kill, he came to take. And just like that, Louis vanished into the dark. It took 10 days before the police finally caught up with him. On December 30th, Louis was arrested. A tip had come in from his girlfriend's cousin, who said Louis came home that night bragging about stolen Christmas presents. That clue cracked everything open. At first, Louis denied everything. But later he confessed to the Sturmfels murders, to the attack on the Rectors, even to another killing back in 1986. He told police he had urges to kill and that the victims were chosen at random. In July 1990, Louis Gaskin was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted murder, and he was sentenced to death. He spent 33 years on death row, filing appeals that never went anywhere. On April 12, 2023, the state of Florida carried out his sentence. For his last meal, he requested barbecue pork ribs, buffalo wings, turkey neck, shrimp fried rice, French fries, and water. His sister came to visit, but no spiritual advisor stood by his side. In his final moments, no one from the victims' families attended the execution. Strapped to the gurney, Louis gave his final words. "Justice is not about the crime. It's not about the criminal. It's about the law." He was pronounced dead at 6:15 p.m. Louis Gaskin was 56 years old. With the April executions completed, the next one was scheduled for May 3rd. Let's take a look at what this death row inmate did. The morning of March 31st, 1986, started out quiet in Panama City. 24-year-old Rebecca Went was stretched out by the pool, soaking up the sun outside her apartment. It was supposed to be just another peaceful day. But nearby, hidden behind trees and shadows, someone was watching her. 19-year-old Darryl Barwick had been hanging around the complex. Another tenant, Susanna Capers, noticed him pacing, eyes scanning the area. She was sunbathing too, and saw him head toward Rebecca's unit. Minutes passed. Then Darryl reappeared, walking back across the complex, slipping into the woods without a word. That evening, Rebecca's sister walked through the door and froze. Rebecca lay still on the floor, wrapped in a comforter, soaked in blood. The apartment was a mess. Bloody footprints tracked across the floor, fingerprints left behind by someone who didn't belong. Her swimsuit had been shifted. Her hands were torn up with defensive wounds. The autopsy would later count 37 stab wounds, most to her chest and arms. There were no signs of sexual assault, but tests revealed a semen stain on the comforter. The DNA didn't leave much room for doubt, and Darryl fell into the tiny percentage of the population who matched it. At first, he denied everything, but after his arrest on April 15th, his story changed. Then it broke entirely. He told police he'd watched Rebecca that morning, then returned home for a knife. He paced outside her apartment 3 times before finally working up the nerve to follow her inside. He said it wasn't supposed to happen like that. He just wanted to steal something, anything. But when she saw him and fought back, something in him snapped. The first stab came fast, then another, and another. He kept going, long after she hit the ground. Soon after, Darryl was charged with first-degree murder, armed burglary, attempted sexual battery, and armed robbery, and the judge made it official. Darryl was sentenced to die. He spent 31 years on death row, appealing every chance he got, but the evidence held, and by May 3, 2023, 36 years after the crime, time had run out. His final meal came that morning: fried chicken, mac and cheese, black-eyed peas, rice, and cornbread, with Coke to drink and ice cream for dessert. Strapped to the gurney, Darryl gave one last statement. "I can't explain why I did what I did. It's time to apologize to the family. I'm sorry." Then he turned his attention to Florida's criminal justice system, urging more compassion and criticizing life sentences for teenagers, as he was only 19 when he committed the crime. At 6:02 p.m., the sedative entered his bloodstream. He closed his eyes, and moments later, the warden checked for signs of life. At 6:14 p.m., Darryl Barwick was pronounced dead. He was 56 years old. And if you thought this was shocking, wait until you hear what the next man did. On June 22, 2000, Michael Tisius stepped through the front door of Randolph County Jail carrying a .22 caliber pistol in his waistband. He'd been here before, first as a short-term inmate, then as a visitor smuggling in goods to his former cellmate. That man, Roy Vance, had fed Michael stories. Fantasies about escape plans and promises of loyalty, a kind of brotherhood Michael never had growing up. For a lonely kid who'd spent his life drifting between neglect and invisibility, it felt like purpose. The plan had started as whispers behind bars, but now it became real. Now, just days after his own release, Michael was back. Tracy Bullington, Roy's girlfriend, was behind the wheel that night. The two of them drove in circles for hours before the hit, a cassette tape blaring the song Mo Murda on repeat. And the lyrics weren't background noise, they were fuel. At one point, Michael told Tracy he planned to go in with a blaze of glory. She thought he was just talking tough, but he wasn't. He meant it. At 12:15 a.m., they pulled up. Michael rang the bell. The guards knew his face and let him in without question. Inside the dispatch room, he kept it casual, chatting with officers Jason Acton and Leon Egley about life, about being out again. It felt almost routine, but Tracy, waiting outside, saw the moment everything changed. The pistol slid into view by his leg. She didn't say a word. Michael didn't either. He raised the gun and pulled the trigger, shooting Jason point blank in the forehead. Leon reached for help, unarmed, but Michael turned and fired again. Jason died instantly. Leon hit the ground, wounded and bleeding, struggling to stay alive. Michael fumbled with a ring of keys, trying to unlock Roy's cell, but panic slowed him down. He couldn't figure it out. As he searched for another set, chaos unfolded behind him. Leon, still alive, reached out and grabbed Tracy's leg. She screamed, so Michael spun around and raised the gun again. 5 more shots rang out, 3 to Leon's forehead, 1 in the shoulder. The last bullet left him gasping on the floor. By the time officers arrived, it was too late. Leon was dead. Michael and Tracy took off and crossed state lines, dumping the prison keys and tossing the gun off a bridge to cover their tracks. But their run didn't last. The car broke down near St. Joseph and police were already closing in. When they were caught, Michael didn't hold back. He confessed, both in writing and in person. He didn't deny pulling the trigger, but he insisted it wasn't planned. He claimed it wasn't something he sat and thought about. But the jury didn't believe him. In 2001, Michael was sentenced to death for the murders of both officers. He was 19 years old at the time. As for Tracy and Roy, they didn't walk free. Both received 2 consecutive life sentences for their role. Roy eventually admitted he was the one who came up with the plan, that he'd manipulated Michael into doing the worst of it. But by then, it didn't matter. The damage was done. And for Michael, it didn't change anything. He spent the next 22 years on death row. On June 6, 2023, inside Bone Terry Prison, Michael requested his final meal: 2 bacon cheeseburgers, curly fries, regular fries, and a chocolate shake. In his final written words, he said he truly tried to become a better man. "I really tried hard to give as much as I could to as many as I could. I tried to forgive others as I wish to be forgiven." At 6:10 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Michael Tisius was 42 years old. Just 10 days later, another execution was scheduled. But what did he do? And what did he choose for his final meal? Let's take a look. On March 24, 1984, in Delray Beach, 14-year-old Karen Slattery was babysitting. She called her mom one last time just before 10 p.m., a routine check-in. Everything sounded normal. But just after midnight, the couple she was babysitting for walked into a house that felt wrong. The lights were off, the TV was silent, and Karen didn't come to greet them at the door like she always did. They immediately called the police. Inside, officers found Karen's body. She was stabbed repeatedly, sexually assaulted, and left in silence. Someone had cut the screen on a bedroom window to get inside, and a bloody footprint was all they left behind. No one knew who it belonged to, and no one could explain why. Then, 2 months later, on May 29, 1984, another woman was found murdered in her own home, 38-year-old Georgiana Warden. Someone had raped her and then struck her in the head with a hammer. The crime was brutal, calculated, and again, no one knew who was behind it. That changed the very next day, when police arrested Duane Owen, a drifter already on their radar for a series of burglaries. At first, he denied everything. But once the cuffs were on and the door shut behind him, the story changed. Duane started talking, not just about break-ins and fights, but about the killings as well. He walked detectives through it all, his words cold and controlled, even explaining how he stripped off his clothes during the murders to avoid leaving behind a single piece of evidence. And his footprint matched the one found near Karen's body. And for the courts, this was everything they needed. At trial in June 1984, Duane was convicted twice and sentenced to death in both cases. On top of that, he received 3 life sentences for the other violent crimes he admitted to. Still, legal appeals stretched out for decades, and he sat on death row for 38 years, nearly 4 decades of filings, stays, and delays. But eventually, his time ran out. On June 16, 2023, Duane woke up at 7 a.m. He had no visitors that day. At 9:45, he was served his last meal. He had requested a bacon cheeseburger with no bun, onion rings, cherry ice cream, strawberries, and a vanilla milkshake. He drank coffee with it. When asked if he had any final words, he simply said, "No." Not even an apology. At 6:14 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Duane Owen was 62 years old. And the next execution was scheduled just 4 days later, this time in Oklahoma. Let's take a look. On February 3, 1995, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Jemaine Cannon had been out of prison for barely 3 weeks, and he hadn't even finished his sentence for a brutal 1990 assault that left an 18-year-old woman badly injured. No, he escaped custody before serving it fully, and this time the outcome would be even worse. Sharonda Clark was just 20 years old, a young mother raising 2 kids. That night, she was inside her apartment with Jemaine, who was her boyfriend, when things turned violent. What exactly happened between them is still debated, but the result was clear. Sharonda didn't survive it. She was stabbed 3 times in the neck and once in the chest. The blade sliced through her carotid artery and jugular, killing her quickly. Afterwards, Jemaine ran, leaving her lifeless body behind. And it took more than a day before police found her, her apartment silent except for the cries of her young children. But Jemaine didn't get far. In fact, he was the one who called the police. He offered a version of events he would stick to for years, that Sharonda came at him first, that he only swung in self-defense, and that she somehow fell on the knife. He repeated the same version to his mother, trying to make it sound like a tragic accident. But the scene told another story. There were signs of a violent struggle, broken objects and scattered belongings, and no clear evidence that Sharonda had ever held a weapon. The evidence didn't back him up. It pointed to rage, not defense. And because of that, prosecutors charged Jemaine with first-degree murder. At trial in 1996, his attorneys argued that he had lost control, that he panicked and lashed out in fear. But the jury didn't buy it. They saw a man who had a pattern of violence, and this time, someone died because of it. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. And for the next 27 years, Jemaine fought to overturn the verdict, but every court stood by the original decision. On the morning of July 20th, 2023, his fight was over. He sat down for his final meal: chicken breast, sliced brisket, seasoned fries, fried okra, sweet and smoky beans, cherry pie, and a Verner's ginger ale. No one came to visit. At 10:01 a.m. inside the execution chamber at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, Jemaine received a lethal injection. As witnesses watched, he spoke his final words: "I confess with my mouth and believe in my heart that God raised Jesus from the dead, therefore I am saved." He was pronounced dead at 10:13 a.m. Jemaine Cannon was 51 years old. But the death chamber didn't stay quiet for long. Just a day later, another execution was already underway. On February 21, 2001, in Huntsville, Alabama, Dorothy Epps opened her front door to someone familiar. James Barber wasn't a stranger. He had done some repair work around her home and was friends with one of her daughters. So when he showed up that day, she let him in without thinking twice. But once inside, everything changed. James didn't hesitate. He struck the 75-year-old woman with his fist, then reached for a claw hammer and kept going. He chased her from room to room, beating her over and over with the heavy tool. Blood covered the walls and floors as Dorothy tried to fight back, but she couldn't stop him. The autopsy later revealed just how violent the attack had been. Dorothy suffered 19 deep cuts to her head and 7 skull fractures. The hammer had broken her ribs in both the front and back, and the damage stretched to her mouth, eyes, and even her tongue. Her hands and arms were slashed from trying to fight him off, and what made it worse was that she was conscious through most of it. James confessed not long after the attack. He told police he beat Dorothy, then grabbed her purse and ran. His trial started in 2003, and the jury didn't need much convincing. The vote came back 11-1 for death, and the judge didn't hesitate to follow it. Nearly 20 years passed as James Barber sat on Alabama's death row until the date was finally set, July 21, 2023. That morning, he skipped breakfast, but ate some snacks and made phone calls. Over 2 days, 32 visitors came to see him, with 22 of them visiting on his final day. That evening, he requested his last meal: a Western omelet, loaded hash browns, spicy sausage, toast, and coffee. A breakfast for a man who wouldn't live to see the sun rise. Just before 2 a.m. in the execution chamber at Atmore, officials asked if he had any final words. James looked up and said, "I forgive you for what you are about to do." Then he turned toward the victim's family. "I want to tell the Epps family I love them. I'm sorry for what happened. No words would fit how I feel." He was pronounced dead at 1:56 a.m. James Barber was 64 years old. The next execution was scheduled for 2 weeks later. But what exactly did he do? On the morning of July 26, 2002, 6-year-old Casey Williamson disappeared from her family's home in Valley Park, Missouri. It was just after sunrise. She had been playing in the kitchen when her father stepped into the bathroom. But when he came back out, she was gone. At first, they thought maybe she was hiding. But as minutes turned to half an hour, panic set in. Something was wrong. By that afternoon, the town had turned into a search grid. Police officers, sheriff's deputies, FBI agents, and volunteers swept through yards, wooded trails, and empty buildings. Casey had never run off before. She wasn't the kind of kid to slip out unnoticed, which is why attention turned fast towards someone who had been there that night. 24-year-old Johnny Johnson, a longtime family acquaintance who had stayed over after the family barbecue. But when officers tried to question him, Johnny was nowhere to be found. That's when the fear turned to suspicion. When they finally tracked him down, Johnny said he hadn't seen Casey. But that lie didn't hold. Bit by bit, the truth came out. He admitted luring her to an abandoned glass factory not far from her house. He said he tried to rape her. And when she fought back, he grabbed a rock and smashed her skull. She died there in a cold, dark pit less than a mile from where she lived. One of the volunteers searching for her made the heartbreaking discovery. Johnny had only been out of a psychiatric hospital for 6 months. His lawyers claimed he was mentally ill, that he suffered from schizophrenia, and couldn't tell right from wrong. But the prosecution painted a different picture. They pointed to how he'd lied to police, tried to hide what he'd done, and avoided getting caught. This wasn't a man lost in delusion, they argued. This was a man who knew exactly what he was doing and did it anyway. In 2005, a jury found Johnny guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death. He received 3 additional life sentences for attempted rape, kidnapping, and armed criminal action. On August 1, 2023, inside the prison at Bonne Terre, Johnny made his final meal request: a bacon cheeseburger, curly fries, and a strawberry shake. Before the execution, he wrote a short note: "God bless. Sorry to the people and family I hurt." But that wasn't all. In a strange final claim, he told staff he was a vampire and warned that the devil would end the world if he was killed. At 6:33 p.m., after spending 18 years on death row, he was pronounced dead. Johnny Allen Johnson was 45 years old. Now let's continue, as just 2 days later, the next execution was carried out in Florida. On the night of April 20th, 1988, Patricia Miller was at home alone in Melbourne, Florida. She was a 41-year-old nurse winding down her evening, unaware that someone was climbing through her bedroom window. The man didn't know her, but he brought a knife, and once inside, he raped her, beat her with a hammer, and tied her up with shoelaces. When it was over, he set the bed on fire and slipped away into the dark. No fingerprints, no witnesses, and the case went cold fast. It stayed that way for 9 years until the same man strangled his estranged wife, Linda Barnes, in nearby West Melbourne. She had filed a restraining order against him, but he didn't care. He strangled her, stuffed her body in a closet, and stayed inside her home like nothing had happened, until deputies found him the next day. He didn't even try to run. They arrested him on the spot and later sentenced him to life without parole. His name was James Barnes. In 2005, years into his life sentence, James converted to Islam. And during Ramadan, he said he wanted to clear his conscience. He wrote a letter confessing to Patricia's murder, not just a vague admission, but a detailed account that matched details only the killer could have known. He didn't pretend it was for redemption. He said Patricia had to die because he didn't want to leave a witness. DNA had linked him years before, but he had stayed quiet. Now, he said, he was ready to face the consequences. He waived a jury trial and acted as his own lawyer. In court, he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, burglary, 2 counts of sexual battery, and arson. And on December 13, 2007, the judge sentenced him to death. In the years that followed, James drew attention. In 2010, he was interviewed for Werner Herzog's On Death Row, and not long after, James sent Herzog a letter admitting to 2 more killings, Chester Wetmore and Brenda Fletcher, both unsolved cases. One was a teenage runaway, the other a drug-addicted woman with no family. James gave horrifying details of the cases, but the police never filed charges, and the cases stayed open. On June 22, 2023, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed James's death warrant, and James didn't fight it. In court, he told the judge he wouldn't appeal and accepted the outcome. His own sister agreed with the sentence, saying, "Maybe we'll be able to sleep in peace." In the final days, James declined all visitors, turned down his special final meal, and he offered no last words before the injection began. On August 3, 2023, after spending 16 years on death row, he was pronounced dead at 6:13 p.m. James Barnes was 61 years old. Oof, those crimes were cruel. Let's continue with the next execution. What did he do? Before the sun rose on December 20, 1996, Julie Buskin vanished from her apartment complex in Norman, Oklahoma. She had just returned from dropping off a friend at the airport and was planning to head home to Arkansas to celebrate her college graduation. But she never made it out of the parking lot. Witnesses later told police they heard a scream, followed by a man shouting, "Just shut up and get in the car." That same afternoon, a fisherman made a grim discovery at Lake Stanley Draper. Julie's body lay along the shoreline. She had been raped, badly beaten, and shot once in the head. She was just 21 years old, a ballet dancer whose life was stolen before it even began. For years, the case sat cold. Detectives followed leads, tested DNA against a string of suspects, but came up with nothing every time. But in 2004, a break finally came. Advances in forensic technology linked DNA from Julie's underwear to Anthony Sanchez, a convicted burglar already serving time behind bars. At the time of the crime, Anthony had been just 18, but he didn't confess. And even with the DNA match, the ballistic links, and the Nike shoe prints, he stuck to his story. He was innocent. His lawyers pointed to his mental health and argued that his judgment had been clouded, but the jury saw it differently. In 2006, they convicted him of rape, sodomy, and first-degree murder, and they sentenced him to death. In the years that followed, Anthony kept fighting. He changed his story, claiming from death row that his own father had committed the murder. But his father had already taken his own life, so that claim couldn't be tested. He said the DNA was wrong, that the system failed him. But court after court pointed to the same evidence, and none of his appeals stuck. On the morning of September 21, 2023, after nearly 3 decades of grief and courtroom battles, the case reached its final chapter. Anthony chose a last meal of chicken fried steak, fried okra, mashed potatoes with gravy, a roll, sweet tea, and apple pie with vanilla ice cream. At 10:08 a.m., the first dose of the lethal injection was given. Lying on the gurney, Anthony used his last words, taking aim at his former attorneys and briefly thanking the few who had stood by him all this time. His final statement ended with, "I'm innocent. I didn't kill nobody." At 10:19 a.m., Anthony Sanchez Castillo was pronounced dead. He was 44 years old. And just 2 weeks later, another inmate faced the same fate. But what did he do? Let's take a look. In June 1996, Michael Zack walked out of jail with nothing but rage behind his eyes and no intention of staying out of trouble. Over the next 9 days, he tore across Florida in a spree that started small, with stolen guns and a pickup truck, but quickly spiraled into something much darker. Beneath the surface, the violence had always been there, and it didn't take long for it to explode. On June 13th, he met 40-year-old Lori Russillo at a bar on Okaloosa Island. She thought he was just another drifter, someone to share drinks, drugs, and a few hours with. She approached him and struck up a conversation. Before long, they left together in the Honda Michael had stolen. The plan, at least on the surface, was to find a quiet spot and use cocaine. But things quickly escalated. As they drove, Lori grew uneasy. Something about Michael set her off, and she demanded to be let out. She reached for the door. That's when Michael veered off the main road, slammed on the brakes, and pulled over. Lori tried to get away, but he attacked her. He smashed her head into the passenger side door, then yanked her out of the car and slammed her head against the frame. When she went down, he didn't stop. He kicked her, beat her, and eventually wrapped his hands around her neck until she stopped breathing. Afterward, Michael dragged her off the side road and tried to bury the evidence, literally. He kicked some sand over her, thinking it would hide what he'd done. But when investigators found her, the scene spoke for itself. Her tube top was torn and slung low on one hip. Her pants had been pulled down to her ankle, but her socks and shoes were still on. Michael claimed she had undressed herself before losing consciousness, but the forensic evidence said otherwise. A semen sample was recovered, too small for a full DNA profile, but enough to raise doubts about every word of his story. What happened wasn't an accident, and it wasn't over yet, because less than 24 hours later, he did it again. This time, it was on Pensacola Beach. Michael met 31-year-old Ravone Smith at a local bar. They drank together, smoked marijuana, and when she invited him back to her place, he followed. But what started as a casual hangout turned into something else entirely. Once inside her home, Michael hit her with a bottle, dragged her to the ground, raped her, then stabbed her 4 times in the chest with an oyster knife. When it was over, he ransacked the house, grabbed whatever valuables he could carry, and vanished. 3 days later, police found him hiding in an abandoned house in Panama City. He didn't resist. In fact, he confessed. Openly, almost matter of fact. He told them about Lori, about Ravone, about the robberies and the lies. He even talked about his past. He spoke of abuse and neglect, and when he was just 11, he watched his mother die after being stabbed by his 16-year-old stepsister. That trauma never left him, and his defense leaned hard on that history: fetal alcohol syndrome, lifelong instability, and untreated mental illness. But none of that erased the brutality of what he'd done. In 1997, a jury convicted him of Ravone's murder, and he was sentenced to death. He spent the next 26 years on death row. During his time on death row, he met his wife while in prison and married her. On October 3, 2023, Michael declined a special last meal. He met with his wife and his spiritual advisor, and when asked for his last words, he faced the witnesses and simply said, "I love you all." At 6:14 p.m., Michael Zack was pronounced dead. He was 54 years old. Now let's continue with the next one. On October 4, 2000, outside a shopping mall in Plano, Texas, Jedidiah Murphy waited with a gun at his side and a plan in his mind. He watched as 80-year-old Bertie Cunningham returned to her car, unaware that her afternoon shopping trip would be the last thing she ever did. Jedidiah walked up and forced her inside at gunpoint. Then he climbed in behind the wheel and pulled away like nothing was wrong. But the nightmare was just beginning. Somewhere along the way, he pushed Bertie into the trunk and shot her. But he didn't stop there. Instead of fleeing or hiding the evidence, he spent hours behind the wheel with her body in the back, driving around like nothing had happened. He even stopped to pick up his niece and 2 of her friends from school. Bertie was dying in the trunk while her killer played chauffeur. Using the money he stole from her purse, he bought the kids motorized scooters, acted like the fun uncle, and kept driving. But eventually, he had to get rid of Bertie, so he drove to a shallow creek and pulled her out. She was still breathing when he tossed her in like garbage and left her to die. Then he drove off, using her credit cards to buy alcohol, beer, and whatever else caught his eye. He was still drinking when the police closed in, and when they did, the evidence was everywhere. Birdie's blood, her car, her credit cards, all of it tied back to him. In June 2001, the jury didn't hesitate. They found him guilty of capital murder and gave him a death sentence. He spent the next 22 years fighting it, but in the end, the sentence held. On October 10, 2023, ironically, World Day Against the Death Penalty, Jedidiah spent his last hours inside the Huntsville unit. Texas no longer offered death row inmates a special last meal, but Jedidiah chose from the standard menu: baked chicken, cheesy rice, vegetables, peaches, and a cheeseburger. When the time came, they led him to the execution chamber and strapped him down. A Jewish spiritual advisor stood at his side, one hand resting over his chest, offering silent comfort. Jedidiah's final words were quiet but deliberate. "To the family of the victim, I sincerely apologize for all of it," he said. "I hope this helps, if possible, give you closure." Then, before the drugs flowed into his veins, he began a lengthy recitation of Psalm 34, which ended with him saying, "The Lord redeems the soul of his servants, and none of those who trust in him shall be condemned." Jedidiah Murphy was pronounced dead at 10:15 p.m. He was 48 years old. Well, that was something. Now let's continue with the next execution. On April 26, 1990, Brent Brewer and his girlfriend, Christy Nystrom, were drifting through Amarillo, Texas, with no money and nowhere to go. A few weeks earlier, Brent had been released from a state hospital after his grandmother found a suicide note in his bedroom. He'd been battling with major depression, severe anxiety, and substance abuse. That's where he met Christy, who was in there for drug rehabilitation treatment. Together they had nothing, so they turned to someone who did. That afternoon, they crossed paths with Robert Laminack outside his flooring shop, a 65-year-old man just trying to finish his workday. And when they asked for a ride to the Salvation Army, Robert said yes without hesitation. Christy slid into the passenger seat while Brent climbed into the back of Robert's pickup. They hadn't been driving long when Brent made his move. Somewhere along the route, he pulled out a butterfly knife, and without a word of warning, he leaned forward from the back of the truck and drove the blade straight into Robert's neck. Robert begged for his life, trying to hand over his keys and wallet as Brent demanded, but the wounds to his carotid artery and jugular vein were fatal. He lost consciousness quickly and bled out while Brent and Christy drove off in his truck. The couple took Robert's wallet containing $140 and went to a friend's apartment where they changed out of their blood-soaked clothing. Then they left Amarillo and headed south, vanishing for a while. But they didn't make it far. Just 2 weeks after the murder, police tracked Brent and Christy to Red Oak, a quiet town just outside of Dallas. Both were arrested, and by 1991, Brent was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Christy received life in prison. The prosecution didn't hold back. They showed the jury bloody crime scene photos, Brent's fingerprint on the knife, and testimonies from people who said Brent smirked and giggled when talking about Robert's dying pleas. They even displayed a photo of Brent giving the middle finger as he left the courthouse after his first arraignment. Brent's defense tried to humanize him. His mother and sister testified, along with prison guards who said he'd been a model inmate for nearly 2 decades. Brent took the stand too, admitting what he'd done and saying he was sorry. But it wasn't enough. On November 9, 2023, after spending 32 years on death row, 53-year-old Brent Ray Brewer lay strapped to a gurney as the lethal injection was prepared. When asked for his final words, Brent's voice cracked as he spoke. "I would like to tell the family of the victim that I could never figure out the words to fix what I have broken," he said. "I just want you to know that this 53-year-old is not the same reckless 19-year-old kid from 1990. I hope you find peace, and I mean it." The drugs were administered, and Brent was pronounced dead at 6:39 p.m. As one case ended, another one was already moving toward the same outcome just a week later. But what did he do? On February 18, 1993, in Morgan County, Alabama, 18-year-old Casey McWhorter helped plan and carry out the cold-blooded murder of Edward Lee Williams Sr., a man who had welcomed him into his home. The killing wasn't impulsive. For weeks, Casey had been part of a plan alongside two younger teens, 15-year-old Daniel Minor and 16-year-old Edward Lee Williams Jr. Yes, you heard that right, Edward's own son. Their goal was simple and cold: steal from a man they knew and leave no witnesses behind. That afternoon, another friend dropped the trio off near the Williams home. They broke in and waited. While inside, they made makeshift silencers out of a plastic jug and a pillow, then tested them by firing rounds into a mattress. They knew exactly what they were about to do. But when Edward came home earlier than expected, a fight broke out as Edward Sr. tried to get the rifle away from Daniel. And that's when Casey stepped in, raising the gun and firing the first shot. What followed was a storm of bullets, at least 11 rounds in total. And when the shooting stopped, Casey walked over to Edward's body and fired one last time, a bullet to the head, just to be sure. Afterward, they ransacked the house and took Edward's wallet, his possessions, and his truck. Nothing was off limits. Then they regrouped at a planned meeting spot, stripped the truck for parts, and split what they'd stolen. Meanwhile, Edward Lee Williams Sr. lay dead in his home. The medical examiner later confirmed what no one wanted to hear. He didn't die instantly. The final bullet had pierced his brain, but he'd bled out slowly, the cavity in his chest filling with blood as life drained from his body. Detectives didn't need long to figure out who were responsible. Casey confessed, and so did the fourth teen who helped with the plan but hadn't pulled a trigger. He testified in court, laying out every step. A neighbor remembered seeing Casey afterward, showing off stolen items and bragging like the whole thing had been a twisted game. And every piece of physical evidence backed the story. In 1994, a jury found Casey guilty of capital murder. He was just 18 when they sentenced him to death. Over the next 29 years, he sat on death row, filing appeal after appeal, none of them changing the outcome. Daniel Minor and Edward Lee Williams Jr., both underage at the time, were spared the needle but not freedom. Each received life behind bars, and as of now, neither has been granted parole. In the final days before his execution, Casey McWhorter reflected on his actions. The man who once boasted about murder now showed regret. He said he wished young people would take a breath before doing something they can't undo. Anything that comes across them that just doesn't sit well at first, take a few seconds to think that through, he said. Because one bad choice, one stupid mistake, one dumb decision can alter your life, and those that you care about, forever. He reflected on how far removed he'd once felt from the reality of death row. I knew there was a death penalty, but I didn't think it pertained to me. I thought it was for Timothy McVeigh. I didn't think someone like me would fall under those parameters. It was like a baseball bat to the face. On November 16, 2023, at Holman Correctional Facility, the state carried out his sentence. Casey declined breakfast and lunch, and when it came time for his last meal, all he asked for was a peach Sunkist and a handful of turtles. No friends or family sat behind the glass when the time came. When asked for last words, Casey apologized to Edward's family, said he loved his own mother, and then turned his attention to the warden. "It's not lost on me that a habitual abuser of women is carrying out this procedure," he said, his voice steady, locking eyes with the man overseeing his death. At 6:33 p.m., the drugs began to flow. Casey's spiritual advisor stood beside him as he clenched his fists and moved his legs. At 6:37, Casey raised his head, gasped once, and went still. By 6:56 p.m., he was officially pronounced dead. Casey McWhorter was 49 years old. What do you think about this case? Should he have been spared the death penalty because he was just 18 at the time of the crime? Let us know in the comments. Now let's move on to the next one. On November 18, 2001, El Paso felt safe until it wasn't. Inside a busy Walmart, 5-year-old Alexandra Flores stood near her parents, caught in the holiday bustle like every other kid her age. But in the blink of an eye, she vanished. 1 second she was there, and the next, gone. Panic spread fast. Surveillance tapes were pulled, parking lots checked, and shoppers questioned. But Alexandra was already gone. By sunrise, the search turned into a nightmare. 16 miles from where she disappeared, a passerby made a gruesome discovery in an alley. Alexandra's small body left behind like trash. She had been struck in the head, strangled, and set on fire. A plastic bag was found over her face, and the medical examiner confirmed what no one wanted to hear. This had been deliberate, violent, and without mercy. Someone had taken her, hurt her, and tried to destroy the evidence. But investigators didn't have to look far. They quickly zeroed in on David Renteria, a 32-year-old with a past that made investigators take a hard look. A Walmart security guard stepped forward and remembered speaking with him that day while his van had been left running outside the store. And surveillance footage backed it up, showing a man, dressed like David, walking out hand in hand with Alexandra. Then came the evidence. Alexandra's blood was found in the van, and the plastic bag over her face carried a clear palm print, David's. And this wasn't the first time he'd hurt a child. He was already a registered sex offender, on probation for molesting an 8-year-old girl just 2 years earlier. Still, after his arrest on December 3rd, David tried to deflect blame. He claimed the killing was done by a gang member named Flacco, someone he'd supposedly met in prison, and that he'd only helped because they threatened his family. He said he was just the middleman, a pawn, but jurors didn't see a pawn. They saw a predator who'd lied before and was lying again. In 2003, a jury found David Renteria guilty of capital murder and sentenced him to death. On November 16, 2023, after spending 15 years on death row, David received his final meal. He wasn't allowed to choose a special last meal and had what was on the menu that day. As the pentobarbital began to flow at 7 p.m., he spoke his last words. "I'm sorry for all the wrongs I have done, and for those who have called for my death, who are about to murder me, I forgive you." He added, "To the victims of the family, there is not a day that goes by that I do not think about that fateful event. I beg for forgiveness." He was pronounced dead at 7:11 p.m. David Renteria was 54 years old. And that brings us to the last death row inmate executed in 2023. Phillip Hancock was just 18 when he took his first life. It happened in broad daylight at a park in Oklahoma City with a crowd of teenagers close enough to see it all unfold. The victim was Charles Lester Warren, a 27-year-old local dealer with a reputation for violence. According to Phillip, Charles had been beating him over a stolen ring. That day, he said, was just the breaking point. Phillip pulled a rifle and opened fire. 5 bullets hit Charles, and 2 other people standing nearby were wounded in the chaos as well. A jury heard the details and decided it wasn't cold-blooded murder, but it wasn't self-defense either. They called it manslaughter and handed down a 4-year sentence. But in the end, Phillip served less than 3. For nearly 2 decades, he managed to stay out of prison. He found work, built a life, and stayed quiet. But whatever demons had driven him that first time didn't stay buried, because in April 2001, he did it again. That night inside Robert Jett's house, the mood twisted fast. What began as a drug-fueled hangout spiraled into something much worse. Robert was 38 and his friend James Lynch was 58. A woman named Smokey Tarp was there too, caught in the middle of what would become a bloodbath. Phillip claimed that Robert pulled a gun over an argument about cigarettes. He said he was lured there, ambushed, and according to him, Robert had a gun and 2 knives and attacked him with a metal bar. There was even a locked cage in the living room, he said, and Robert tried to shove him inside. That's when the struggle started. Phillip said he managed to grab the gun, turn it around, and fire. He claimed it was self-defense, but when it was over, both Robert and James were dead, and his story wasn't the only one. Smokey told investigators a different version. She said Phillip chased Robert into the backyard. She heard Robert beg for his life, and then she heard the gunshots. Later, Phillip's ex-girlfriend stepped forward with her own confession. She admitted she had told Robert and James to deal with Phillip after he confronted her about her drug use. Phillip disappeared after the murders, and for more than a year, he stayed ahead of law enforcement, hiding in plain sight. But in 2002, he was picked up on unrelated gun and drug charges. When his DNA hit the system, everything unraveled. Forensic evidence tied him directly to the double homicide, and he was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. At trial in 2004, Phillip stuck to the same story that had worked once before in 1982, self-defense. He told the jury he'd been afraid for his life, that he had no choice. But this time, the courtroom didn't buy it. They listened as prosecutors laid out the aftermath, how Robert had been gunned down outside and left in the dirt, and how James was found dead inside the house. The story sounded less like survival and more like an execution. The jury didn't take long and came back with 2 death sentences. And just like that, Phillip began the long countdown, what would become a 19-year wait on death row. At 11 a.m. on November 30th, 2023, Phillip was led into the death chamber at Oklahoma State Penitentiary. For his final meal, he requested a bucket of KFC dark meat and a root beer. He had no visitors that day. He used his final words to lash out at the prosecution and once again insisted the killings were acts of survival. "They're vile," he said. "They're virtueless. They're without honor." Phillip was pronounced dead at 11:29 a.m. He was 59 years old. This concludes all executions carried out in 2023. If you liked this video, make sure to check out the next one, because just when you thought it couldn't get worse, well, it can. And the next cases are even more disturbing.